So in the last lecture, we looked at Paul's general argument, right? This idea that we can't really know whether it's good for us to have children or not until we actually have them is part of a more general argument, right? That to know whether something is good for you in a lot of cases and how good for you, you need to have the relevant experience, but you can't have the relevant experience without actually doing it, right? Seems to show that it's impossible for us to make a rational or justified choice. But remember, I said, there's two premises in her argument we need to ask ourselves whether they're true or not, right? Premise one, is this claim to know what an experience is like, you must have had that specific experience or one close enough to it, right? Relevantly like it. Is that true? Well, Paul makes a lot of parenthood. Let's take parenthood as a test case. Now, I think it's pretty clear. I think it's beyond argument that you can't, with, no experience at all, you can't just sit down and imagine what it's like to be a parent and come even close, right? If you tried to do that, probably going to have some fantasy like, you did when you were in elementary school. You have no idea what it's like being a parent, right? But one thing you might ask is, is the only way to get the relevant experience to actually become a parent? How else might you do it? Well, you might babysit your friends' children or your relatives' children, right? Another thing you might do is to read books, articles, interviews, things like that by people who've had children. You might talk to your own parents, right? I guess you might wonder a little bit how honest they're going to be if they think it was a terrible mistake. Hopefully they wouldn't tell you that, right? That would be pretty bad, right? But, I can probably tell you some of what it's like to have children, even if they're going to hedge what they say a little bit. They don't want to hurt your feelings. And you can definitely read people's memoirs. You can look at interviews. There's all kinds of information out there, right? Well, Paul will say, well, babysitting is not enough like having children of your own, right? Let's talk about both these options. We'll start with the babysitting or taking care of children. Paul says that's not enough. I guess you could go with other stuff. You might say, well, babysitting's not enough. Maybe go so far as to do foster care or more extensive volunteering with children. Paul will say, well, that's not like having children of your own. Well, I guess not, right? There's not probably, the length of the relationship's not the same. There's not the hormonal component she makes such a big deal of. But it can get you something, right? I've known people who've decided they don't want to have kids after babysitting, right? They babysit and they're like, oh my God, this is terrible. I hate children. I don't want to do this. It can tell you something, right? It seems to me that people who try babysitting really don't like it, decide they don't like being around kids, decide that they don't want to have kids. That doesn't seem completely irrational to me, right? Surely in many cases, you can get, you might not be able to have the relevant experience, but is it really so clear you can't have something close enough, right? Even with children, is it really so clear you can't have something close enough? If you babysit a lot for your friends or even family, especially family, where there's this much closer connection, if you volunteer in other ways, couldn't that tell you enough of what it's like to have children that you might be able to make a justified choice. Paul thinks not, but I'm just not so sure, right? I just don't know. Well, and think about this, right? Can't other people telling you about their experiences give you some information, some idea of what it's like, right? If you talk to a lot of people who've had children, if you read memoirs, interviews, and that stuff, won't that give you some idea of what it's like? Philosophers often, we'll talk more about testimony later. Philosophers often class all of this under this idea of testimony. Testimony is a source of information, and that has some of its own problems, but can't it do some work, right? Think about some other stuff, some things that are even further out there than having children, right? Imagine people with disabilities, right? More removed from those, for those of us who don't have disabilities, the experience of the disabled is probably more removed from our known experience than would be having children, right? Most of us have spent some time around children. This is radically unfamiliar experience. But if you read memoirs by people who have disabilities, doesn't that give you some idea of what it's like? I mean, it's not perfect. But if you read, Helen Keller was deaf and blind. She has this book, The World I Live In, where she tries to explain her experiences. If you read that, don't you have some better idea of what it's like to be Helen Keller than you did before, right? There's another recent one. I haven't read Haben by this woman who is deaf and blind, who's now an attorney. Again, if you read this, don't you have some better idea of what it's like to be her than you did before? And if that's so for something that's so radically different from our experience than being deaf and blind or seriously disabled in some other way, what's it like to have quadriplegia or paraplegia? Read a memoir by someone who has it, or listen to an interview with this person. Can't you get some idea of what that's like, right? And if you can get some idea of what it's like for this thing that's so radically different, well, can't you get some idea of what it's like to have children, which is not so far removed from our experience, by talking to people who've had them, right? Or, my great uncle was a navigator on a bomber in World War II. I have no real idea what it's like to be in combat, right? To be shot at, to shoot at other people. But I talked to him, right? On these bombers in World War II, everybody had a gun. Even the navigator had a machine gun. I think after talking to him, I have somewhat better idea of what it's like to be in one of these bombers than I did before. I seem to get something out of it, right? Well, again, that's way more removed from average human experience than having children. If you can figure out something about, combat or flying in a B-17, just from hearing people talk about it, can't you get some idea for these other things like having children? So my general point here is this. Imagination completely on its own, completely unconstrained, will get you very little. It probably just gets you fantasy, right? But what about imagination plus a somewhat similar experience? Paul says it's not enough. I don't know. What about imagination plus testimony from someone who's had the experience? Does that give you nothing about what it's like? I think it gets you something, right? It is very hard to say that someone who reads Helen Keller's memoir of being Helen Keller has no better idea of what it's like to be deaf and blind than someone who's never listened to anything from people who have that experience describing it, right? It's hard to say, imagination plus somewhat similar experience It's hard to say that someone who's babysat children or spent a lot of time taking care of them doesn't have a better idea of what it would be like to be a parent than someone who's done nothing. Now, Paul will say, well, these things can give you some idea, but it's still not good enough. Is that true? Well, I just don't know. Nagel makes a weaker point than Paul, right? Nagel will say, well, we can't imagine what it's like to be an animal with radically different life and experiences and senses than we have. I tend to agree with Nagel. I tend to think we have no real idea what it's like to be a dog or a bat, much less an octopus or an eagle, right? But Paul says, well, we can't imagine what it's like to be different kinds of human beings with different experiences. I'm much less sure of that point, right? Animals can't tell us what their experience is like. At least most of them definitely can't, right? I mean, maybe some animals have language. There's Coco the gorilla. There's a few birds that seem to have something like human language. There's some debate about whether they really use language or not. But, at the very least, a dog doesn't use language, right? A bat doesn't use language. So most animals definitely can't tell us what it's like to be them. There's also just much more difference between humans and animals, right? You look at a bat has a completely different kind of life. It's a completely different kind of thing. Humans, even if they have radically different experiences, you might think there's a lot more in common there, right? So even though I'm very sympathetic to Nagel's point, I'm not sure about Paul's point in taking it further, right?